has specifically chosen you to be here at this time and in this place. You have incredible potential, purpose, and calling to push back the darkness and be a light for Christ. Stand for nothing and you'll fall for anything. It's time to stand your ground. This is Unapologetic. Everyone, welcome to Unapologetic. I'm so excited because today we have my friend Nicole Zasowski here with us. She's a licensed professional marriage and family therapist. She is an incredible author, and she is one of my favorite people. So we've been talking about doing this interview for a long time. I'm really excited about the topic today. It is about celebration, and that topic makes some of us excited if you're geared that way naturally, and some people very uncomfortable. And so we're going to talk about how we can celebrate ourselves, celebrate others, celebrate God, and what that looks like as a discipline. And so Nicole will quickly become one of your favorite people, and I am so excited to have her on this show. Hi, Nicole. Thanks for joining us.
Oh my goodness, this is so fun for me. Thank you for having me.
So we're going to start out in the hot seat, just asking what we ask everyone. And I want to see, just with your expertise, you've worked with hundreds, if not thousands, of people who really are struggling in relationships or they're in a new season of life. So I want to ask you, what do you wish Christians understood or knew about relationships?
Oh goodness, so many things. And there's so many things that I'm working on in my own life. So I know the challenge of growing in your relationship with yourself and with other people. But I think if I had to pick one, a healthy relationship with yourself is the key to healthy relationships with other people. So self-regulation, being able to speak truth to your pain. It's so tempting to want other people to fix or to be the healing that we long for the wounds that we've brought into that relationship. And certainly relationships are healing in many ways, but that healing needs to come from us taking responsibility for those wounds first.
Yeah, I know that you've dealt with that. That's such a good point. I was talking to someone even just yesterday, and she's kind of telling me about different trauma in her life. And I was like, well, really, I think you probably need to see a therapist. Sometimes people say, well, Julia's my friend and she's a therapist, so doesn't that count? And I mean, I know that it's just something special about and unique, and there are different ways that we go about actually in therapy helping people. But something she said was, well, I've heard of therapy. I kind of know what goes on there, and it's just about blaming other people. Basically, You go into therapy and blame your parents for everything. And a lot of people have that view, though. So what would you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly not good therapy would do that. Certainly our stories shape the kind of pain that we feel when we experience something hurtful. Like you and I, Julia, could go through the same exact thing tomorrow. And our stories, because they're different in our different families of origin, would shape the kind of the ways that we experienced that hurt. So I might feel not good enough and rejected, and you might feel alone and powerless, just as an example. And that's because the stories we've lived up to that point shape the kind of pain we feel. That is not about blaming any characters in our past. It's just about acknowledging that, yeah, we had some conversations and relationship dynamics and events even that nobody could control that caused some wounding. And no family is perfect. I don't believe we can fully credit or fully blame our families for the people that we are, but it is a reality that our stories shape how we experience the world. And so it's helpful information, but then being able to, now that we're adults and we're empowered to make choices, be able to move forward differently.
Right. Yes, that's kind of what we talked about. It is good, of course, to be able to know kind of root wounds and dysfunction and maybe be able to name the trauma, but then you get to move on from that. And so I think maybe that's a misconception about counseling. Like we do talk about the past and talk about trying to heal those wounds, but then it is up to you. Like we made sense of it. Now, what are you going to do with it? And I'm not sure that everyone understands that that's the process that happens in counseling. But
Yeah.
so tell us about your work. Tell us about your story and how you ended up being a licensed marriage and family therapist. Of course, I love that profession. It's so important getting to help heal marriages and families. But can you just tell us about you and your story?
Absolutely. I didn't grow up thinking that I was going to be a therapist. It's a calling that came to me in college. I was a part of a study abroad program where I lived with 50 other college students, and it just so happened that the faculty family that was with us that year was the head of the psychology department at my school. And she had just sort of been observing me all year, loving those deep conversations. We went abroad sophomore year of college. So, about 20 years old, and a lot of us were away from home to that degree for the first time. This was before technology made it so easy to communicate with people across the world. And so we were really forced to wrestle with our own stories in a new way. And we're having a lot of new experiences. And I loved bearing witness to the growth that happened in that year for so many of my friends and helping people process their own stories. I loved it so much, it didn't even occur to me that it could be part of my career and calling, and how God was trying to call me into that field. So at the end of the year, she said, "Are you sure you don't want to be a therapist?" And it was just so obvious to me that was my path. So it's been a joy ever since. Obviously, it's a challenging field, but I love it. It's a privilege.
That's awesome. So let's talk a little bit about, you've had 2 books come out now. So that's actually, for listeners, that's how Nicole and I became friends, because we both released our first book at the same time. And we're like, oh my goodness, will you pray for me? I'll pray for you. So Nicole has a book, From Lost to Found, and then her new book, Celebration. I was going to say Celebration of Discipline, because that's the old school theology book, but
Yes.
no, that is not what it's called. Sorry. Can you tell us about your second book?
Yes, my new book.
What if it's wonderful?
Yes, yes. My new book is called What If It's Wonderful? Release Your Fears, Choose Joy, and Find the Courage to Celebrate.
So where did that idea come from? Because most of us think, what if it's horrible? And we're pretty sure it's going to be horrible.
Yeah. The title is obviously designed to interrupt all of our other what if questions. What if I fail? What if I am rejected? What if I'm disappointed? And a lot of people assume that book was born out of a season of joy and celebration, and me having a lot to say on the topic of joy and celebration. And while I do now, this book was very much born out of a season of loss and change and chronic heartache. And Julia, that when you go through loss, there's the thing itself, there's what happened, and then there's the cost. And the cost is the impact to our sense of identity and sense of security and safety. And what took me a really long time to realize was that part of the cost for me was that my joy was accompanied by a lot of fear. I was so afraid to hold God's good gifts. I was sure that they'd be ripped from my hands. And, we don't often talk about the fact that joy is the most vulnerable feeling we feel. Brene Brown speaks a little bit about this. But sometimes it's easier, and maybe even we've been taught more responsible, but I don't think that's true, to not hold joy at all than to hold something that might break. And so we keep our expectations low, we don't get our hopes up, we prepare for the worst case scenario, which the research says doesn't actually
Yeah.
protect us from disappointment. It just protects us from delight. And I was so sad when I woke up one
Mm.
morning and was really grieved that yes, I've experienced a lot of loss in my life, but a lot of the loss has been my refusal to engage with joy and to fully receive that.
Hmm.
And I was
Hmm.
missing out on so much of my life because I was
Yeah.
living so protected.
Yeah. So probably not everyone knows our shared experience, of course, of pregnancy loss. And I think that that's something that happens a lot, of course, and I mean, I know I experienced it. We had 3 miscarriages in a year. Then I got miraculously, thank you, Lord, pregnant with triplets. And I can't say that I had ever struggled with anxiety to that point. And I
Hmm.
couldn't even say the word triplets. Like I was terrified. I was terrified. And I remember like using scripture because I was in the second trimester and like I couldn't enjoy it. Like I would just shake. Like I was terrified. And it's not like
Hmm.
if you Googled anything would come up like, you're going to be okay. Like it was more, no, this is a very scary situation. And then, like, I know, went into labor at 23 weeks and they're like, they're not going to make it. So it was really like one of God's biggest graces to me that I became a therapist, a Christian, obviously, but a therapist before that because I knew,
Hmm.
oh my gosh, like this is trauma, this is anxiety. But I couldn't do anything other than go through Psalms and claim scripture and say, okay, like you have said that you're going to see me through. You have said, I can believe I'll see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. I could not celebrate. And so then, whenever I got into the hospital, this is why I'm like selfishly so excited about your book. But when we got into the hospital, I mean, they told us they're not going to make it. And I heard God say no as loudly as I've ever heard anything. I mean, not audibly, but like in my spirit. But what happened was we didn't know what was going to happen. And so my sweet husband, who is just the best thing ever, this is how it connects with your book. Every week, like from 23 weeks on, we would celebrate that Saturday. We
Ah.
didn't know if we were ever going to meet the triplets. We didn't know if they were going to survive. And every Saturday, we had a celebration of their life. And we're like,
Mm.
pregnant one more week, and it's what got me through. Like, okay, we're going to celebrate what God's done. We're going to celebrate that they're alive, not knowing if we were ever going to meet them. But that was so important instead of
Yeah.
thinking about the future or the past, just really staying in the present and celebrate what was happening now and look for it too, because there was a lot of bad going on too. So, can you just tell us, of course, everyone's story is different, but emotions are the same. How can we stay like present in what God is doing in our lives and celebrate that?
Mm. Well, that is just one of the most beautiful examples I've ever heard. And obviously, I know your story, but to hear you frame it like that in the context of celebration is exactly what we're talking about. I think we have so narrowed our definition of celebration to be a reaction to good news or a reward for some
Yeah.
sort of accomplishment. And I'm
Yeah.
not diminishing or disparaging when celebration looks like that. I think we should continue to celebrate those beautiful, wonderful things that are obviously God's movement in our lives. But then there's what does it look like when we're not sure, when the future's uncertain, or maybe we've received, it's been
Yeah.
a week full of bad news. What does it look like to celebrate? And,
Hmm.
when I looked, I really dove deep into scripture and in neuroscience to
Yeah.
understand celebration. And one of the things that I noticed that was so beautiful in the feasts and festivals outlined for us in the Old Testament was that God's people didn't celebrate when they were in the mood or when they had received good
Hmm.
news or when they had time to do so, it was convenient, or when they'd finished all their work and now they wanted to reward themselves. They celebrated in rhythm. It was whether that was every 50 years or every 7 years, whenever that festival came to be, the Sabbath was weekly. Um, and it was a rhythm of remembrance. It was remembering God's faithfulness in their story. and it kept their celebration tethered to his goodness instead of merely being a reward for our own. And so that's why I love your example so much. It was rhythmic, and it kept you tethered to God's movement in your story and his goodness, which, by the way, is true regardless of the outcome. And so Jesus has given us a permanent reason to celebrate. While we might still suffer, we might still feel sad and disappointed. This isn't some toxic positivity message where, we're expecting the good to cancel all hard feelings. But celebration as a rhythm is so important.
Okay, so let's talk about why people don't celebrate. You and I were chatting about this a little bit offline, and as my listeners know, I'm very prone to celebrate. Like that's just something I would say is a personality probably characteristic. I like to celebrate my friends. I like to celebrate other people. I like to celebrate when something good has happened. But I would say, depending how you're looking at personality, like that is actually like a part of something that is very much something that's needed for me, and Ryan's the same way. So that is just not really a struggle for me, but I will say that sometimes when I've brought it up in Christian circles, I just did a post recently, and it was so funny. It wasn't very spiritual. Well, you know what? That's not really fair to say, because you will feel the same way. For some reason, we think celebration isn't spiritual, like only fasting is or something. But I did a post and said that there was a time, it was when I was becoming a licensed professional counselor, and those hours are just crazy. And I would go buy myself a snow cone because no one was sitting there like clapping for me. It's a very difficult job. It's very upsetting, and it's rewarding, but it's hardcore. Yeah. And so I would make sure that I was celebrating and go buy myself a snow cone. And I felt funny putting it up because I knew people were like, wait, well, why isn't she just talking about like a Bible study of Revelation or something? But it is a spiritual practice. And I had a friend reach out and say, I quit my job and it was something I really worked hard at, and no one cared that it was my last day. So I thought of you and went and got myself a snow cone. And I know that some people would think that's not that important of a spiritual discipline. So can you argue why it is important to celebrate for us spiritually in our connection to God and to other people?
Absolutely. I do think we tend to liken celebration to dessert, like nice to have, but not essential to the Christian life or not essential to our spiritual and emotional growth. And certainly, we can celebrate in a way that doesn't honor God and takes us away from um, our relationship with ourselves, our emotional experience, takes us away from relationships with other people and with God. That would be escapism. But celebration is an avenue of connection, it's an avenue of processing. Look what God has done in my story. Look what he's doing. Um, look at what is good that's in front of me. Even if this is really hard, and that's real too. But it's honoring that both the struggle and the celebration are real. And sometimes we tend to think that only hard things are real, or you're only being vulnerable if you're talking about pain. In fact, joy is the most vulnerable feeling that we feel. Being able to say, this is really beautiful, whether that's in somebody else's life or that's in our life. And it is an avenue of growth that God uses to draw us closer to Him. If I think about beauty, and lots of people say, well, beauty is just frivolous, it doesn't really matter. No, it deeply matters because of where it leads us. It's a reflection of God's character. And so it's an avenue of connection with Him.
And even just thinking about, I mean, the Bible is very clear when someone accepts Christ that the angels in heaven are rejoicing. Like it's not, my dad always says, like, whenever you think about heaven, it's not just like an unending church service. Like there are fun things going on.
Yeah.
And when I was thinking about our talk today, I was thinking about, kind of the main verse I would think surrounding this would be Romans 12:15, rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn. And it just seems like we really focus a lot on the mourning part, like we should mourn with those who mourn versus the rejoicing. And I guess I don't know, but I would assume that probably you had a similar experience. For me, when we were dealing with infertility and dealing with miscarriages, it was very important for me to celebrate other pregnant people and to pray for their families and pray for their babies. Like that was like a supernatural gift that God gave me to be able to say, okay, but I'm part of a bigger story and I'm connected to these other Christians and these other people. And like that really, I mean, truthfully, celebration like took me out of just totally despairing. So what are some reasons that you have seen? You've worked with so many people, and we're going to get to soon how you wrote this during the pandemic because there wasn't a lot to celebrate. So it's really interesting that you wrote this book during that. But real quick, and of course, like I know you're like I am, like we don't want to speak in generalizations. We don't know everyone's story. But if you could, what are the main reasons people don't celebrate?
Yeah, this is certainly not an exhaustive list, but there are about 5 hesitancies that seem to come up over and over again. The first we've talked about, that we're waiting for the other shoe to drop. We're so afraid in that joyful experience that we're going to be disappointed or we're going to despair. The second is that we're waiting for a reason to celebrate. We're not celebrating as a discipline that cultivates joy in our lives. We see our joy sitting on the other side of a dream realized or a goal accomplished or some sort of shift in our circumstances, and we think, well, I'm perfectly willing to celebrate if I had a good thing to celebrate, if I had a reason to do so. And so we don't see it as a practice that's accessible to us now. The third reason is we're not sure how to reconcile this invitation to celebrate with our value of humility. We see those as mutually exclusive instead of actually going together really beautifully. And then the fourth, you just touched on, the rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn. Obviously, we all live in community with different kinds of stories happening all the time, and we're afraid that our pain is going to our joy is going to bump into somebody else's pain, or that our pain is going to prevent us from being able to celebrate a dream that's happening in somebody else's life, especially when it steps on the toes of our own. And then the fifth is something we've touched on a bit as well, is that in that dark season that was characterized by so much pain and loss, my relationship with God was so precious to me, and the ways that I grew and the ways that I was drawn close to Him really, really was such a special gift of that season. And I was scared that would go away in the light of my joy. And I was sad that as somebody who grew up in the church my whole life, I didn't have any context for what it looked like to engage with God deeply in the light of my joy. After researching and writing this book, I now do. But I think sometimes we're hesitant to step into that joy because we don't know where that deep connection looks like.
Yeah. Wow. So many good points. I was getting drawn into everything you were saying. Okay. So how do we move past that? Wait, I have to tell you real quick. So I was sitting around with my family members and we were analyzing a specific problem. And we were kind of like, well, what if this happens? What if this happens? I just immediately said, what if none of that happens? And what if it's wonderful? Because I had just seen is when your book had just come out or you had just told me the title or something.
Aw.
And it brought so much peace. Like we were like, or what if it's great and none of this happens? And I mean, really just, if you don't know anyway, why not just choose to think, what if it's wonderful? What if it's going to be great? Because we really don't know the future anyway. So I know there's so many studies on this. It's not going to help us if we sit around thinking about worst case scenario or think about horrible things. I do want to ask with I know it depends on what your situation is, but I'm thinking about a lot of the people I recently just am doing life with, and they want to celebrate, just really thinking more towards pregnancy. Like they want to celebrate, they want to be happy, but they've had scary things happen. They've seen scary things happen. What are just some practical tools, I guess grounding almost, but just for being able to kind of relieve that anxiety and help experience joy or help celebrate? Like when you really are scared that the other foot's going to drop.
Yes.
Or shoe, sorry.
No, you're good. Foot works too.
The other foot should drop. That's how you walk, but other shoe.
Yes, there's so many. One of the things that when I wrote about practices was really important to me was that all those practices were available and accessible. So meaning no matter what kind of season you're walking, whether it's a season of celebration or a season of sorrow or suffering, these are available to you. My favorite is called the practice of savoring. And what savoring does and why I like it so much, well, there's a few reasons. The first is it celebrates the ordinary. So this is about living a beautiful life with God right where you are. This isn't about adding or changing something about your life. There's a few things going on in the brain that make savoring really important. The first is called the hedonic treadmill, which basically means our brain rapidly adapts to joy. So what's new and exciting at first soon just fades into the background, and the sparkle wears off the moment very quickly. The second is our brains are just stickier with painful input. And so because our brains are so efficient, they're only going to capture and keep what they think they're going to need. So when we're scanning our days, all those beautiful everyday moments of delight are not things that the brain is going to naturally pick up and hold. And the third thing is that we have this awful tendency to tell our joy how it can be improved upon. So, you give a presentation and you feel really great about it, and you see a lot of nods and smiles in the audience, and maybe you get a few compliments on your way back to your seat, and you sit down and you feel so satisfied, and then you think, oh, it would have been better if I used that story. Or they said I was a good speaker, but they didn't say I was a great speaker. We start telling our joy what would make it better. So this is our starting place with the brain. Left on neutral, it leans negative. And savoring is our practice that helps fight against this. So the way that you do this is you take a snapshot. I mean, it could be your 3 darling little ones just playing happily together for 5 seconds, like very, very short snapshot. And you just ask your 5 traditional senses what they're going to remember about that moment. So what do you see? What do you hear? What do you smell? What do you taste? And what do you feel? Some of those answers might be more obvious than others, but all 5 are important. And that helps your brain capture and keep that moment of delight in a way that it can carry it forward, celebrate it, and recall it later. And so this changes our perspective, and it also helps us celebrate what is already happening in your life.
Okay, so that's really interesting because I since, all our kids are obviously the same age. So I had to, like, for a long time, not anxious, but I was concerned. Like, this is the only time I get to do this. Everything needs to be special. Not everything, but like, we need to make really good memories. And so I was researching how can you make memories last? And what you just said,
Yeah.
I read about encouraging your children to do that. So
Yeah.
if you want them to remember really a
Yeah.
special time with your family or a special memory, trying to engage their senses. Is that something that you've heard of? I had never heard of that.
So
do you think that would be important? I wonder what age that would start.
Yeah, I mean, it can't hurt to start now and see what sticks. And we have an upcoming trip as a family that I'm thinking now that I'll start teaching my kids this, at least my oldest, who's 6. But just the ways that I had heard this introduced before, which is a fringe benefit of savoring, is it's also a great practice if, like me, you get anxious. So, because anxiety drags our brain into the future where it imagines all the worst case scenarios, or it drags it into the past where we think what we coulda, shoulda, woulda done differently, this keeps us very present to the moment. I also like it because where we're tempted to capture a moment for Instagram on our phones, it can actually be a relationally disconnecting thing. This is relationally connecting. It keeps you in that moment and helps you savor the memory in a different way.
Yes. So my husband and I are just huge fans of The Office, and
Uh-huh.
so whenever the two main characters get married, they don't have a photographer, and they go like this, and because it's like the special moments, they pretend like they have a camera and they click it, and that's something Ryan and I have started. Like when we realize we're in a special moment, we just look at each other and like click a pretend picture, and
Oh,
it's like take notice. And I mean, I just think it's important I know you obviously understand this. There are just things that are easier for some people and harder for others. But we can learn disciplines. And so really learning celebration as a discipline is something that we can all do while understanding, of course, that it does come easier to some people than others. Would you agree that it's easier for some people than other people?
yes, I think in the ways that we traditionally think of celebration, where maybe there's a
Mm-hmm.
festive element to it, or there are people who are just
Mm-hmm.
constantly on the lookout for reasons to celebrate, and I think that's a beautiful way that
Yeah.
God knit them together, and it's an important practice for
Mm-hmm.
all of us. And
Mm-hmm.
that might look like I talk
Mm-hmm.
about receiving affirmation without
Yeah.
disqualifying or dismissing the compliment. It might look like
Mm-hmm.
practicing Thanksgiving. We talk a lot about gratitude, which is great, it does increase our
Mm-hmm.
joy.
Mm-hmm.
Thanksgiving, the practice of actually expressing the joy that we feel to our friends is or family or whoever we're
Mm-hmm.
expressing Thanksgiving to actually doubles the joy that we glean from simply feeling gratitude.
Wow.
So that's one of my favorite ways of practicing celebration because I would say I am a social
Mm-hmm.
introvert. I love the one on one and I love the one on two, like small group relating, but
Mm-hmm.
big, extravagant, loud is not really my thing. And so finding ways
Yeah.
to celebrate your life that are a good fit for you and then challenging
Mm-hmm.
yourself toward this
Yeah.
discipline. I think especially in just being able to celebrate a
Mm-hmm.
point of progress or to receive a compliment without
Mm-hmm.
shaming yourself and thinking of ways that the
Yeah.
compliment isn't true. All these little things also
Yeah.
count and are part of the discipline.
Right. And I was thinking about that too. I'm sure shame goes a lot into it, but ultimately, remembering that God celebrates us
Yep.
and that He is so excited about the things that are going on in our lives. And that's, of course, a more traditional look at it, but just remembering that He's there too and that He loves celebration. Okay, so tell us how we can find your book, how we can connect with you, just how can we have more Nicole, more What If It's Wonderful?
Yes, I would love to connect with any listener or reader. My book, What If It's Wonderful, can be found anywhere you like to buy books. Certainly, it's on Amazon, or your local bookstore can order it for you if they don't have it. And my website is a great place to connect with me, which is just Nicole Zasowski, NicoleZasowski.com. And I actually have a free guide on there, because the title, What If It's Wonderful, is obviously meant to interrupt the other what if questions that we carry around, like what if I fail, or
Right.
what if I'm disappointed. It's a guide. It's like a therapeutic guided journal, to help you work through your own what if questions to a place of an expectant heart. And if that sounds helpful to you,
Love
you
that.
can download it for free.
That's awesome. And we will have all of that information whenever this show comes out and whenever it posts. So I just want to thank you so much. It's so fun to connect with you. And I just love what you're doing. I love your books. And I just want to thank you for being so authentic and aware of the felt needs going on in the world today. But thank you for being on, Nicole.
This was such a joy for me. Thanks, Julia.
Thank you for tuning in to Unapologetic. This was a great episode just to encourage you and your friends who are maybe struggling with how to celebrate, or if you're concerned about the future. And I just hope that this brought so much life to you and encouragement. Please share with your friends, and remember that you can find today's episode and more at ptv.org/Julia and wherever you get your podcasts.